Good morning, and welcome to our meeting. Welcome to all the observers. Sorry for the slight delay in the opening of the meeting. As I said quickly to people in the room, that this is just raises the expectation level for our technology discussion. The technology position is really important for this board because it will unlock a lot of future decisions in terms of where we go on a few key projects. As we know, the integrated effort on audit evidence, 330 and 520, but it also will sort of determine how we think about technology and incorporate it in future standards work, and also in terms of future work plan decisions. So I think this is really an important discussion, and it is only the first product to where we're seeking to go in the future. So the statement is really a signal to the marketplace about our willingness to add technology into the standards, even though we all know that there are elements of technology in our standards already. But this is discussion will sort of say, should we move further than where we are today? Which there was a general sense at our March meeting that we should. And so I really look forward to the discussion led by Angelo and Fadi, benefiting from our workshops in March. And I really look forward to active participation from this group. The goal isn't to wordsmith everything, but to get the right direction. So we have a pretty firm statement today with the ability to tweak language afterwards. So Angela, I'm going to turn the floor over to you, and feel free to get us rolling.
Okay, thank you, Tom. So good morning, everybody. Tom reached out to me yesterday, and he said, this thing sounds like it's coming in a little loud. Is it coming in? Oh, is it perfect? Okay. So Tom reached out to me yesterday. He said, are we ready for tomorrow? I said, no, but let's do it. Let's make lemonade. And actually, I'm pretty happy to be engaging with you earlier, and looking forward to some really interesting discussion. And I guess the big advantage of having it today is that I can watch the game tonight between Italy and Spain, unencumbered by thoughts that I have to give this presentation tomorrow. Anyway, so let's move on in the presentation. All right, so before the timing reshuffle, we had planned for a 2-hour session with a big chunk of time dedicated to, 2/3 in fact, dedicated to questions 1 and 2, which you'll recall from the paper deal with the feedback we'd received and with the position statement. And then we'd left 40 minutes to deal with sections 3 and 4, which deal with components 2 and 3 respectively, that are more the organizational matters dealing with the technology position. But I understand that that we may have a little bit more time. So depending on how this conversation goes and the level of interest, we can even have a little bit more time, but we'll play it by ear. So I'm going to come back to what that means, components 1, 2, and 3 in the next slide to tell you, just to remind you a little bit on what that is. So before we turn to the roundtable, I've got some introductory comments, which I hope will be some good background to kind of kick off our conversation. All right, about this slide. This is a quick reminder on what the initiative is all about. The slide shows this initiative, which was approved by the board as part of its strategy and work plan, was approved in December. And this initiative is fundamentally about the board taking a pause to introspect about whether its current approach on how it integrates considerations about the use of technology and its standards remains appropriate and suitable in light of how quickly and rapidly technology is advancing that we're all witnessing. And this is the components that I was referring to earlier. Certainly, this is not the first time you've seen this chart. It's been tweaked a little bit, but ultimately, this is the conceptual framework that the board endorsed in March. Recall that the aim of having this conceptual framework is to allow the board to discuss each component separately. and including the organizational matters that are part of components 2 and 3. What I would probably think are probably the lesser important, maybe, components of the technology position. So that technology position statement, which is part of component 1, we were previously referring to this as the technology posture. We've lost that name because a lot of people didn't like it. So it's now called the position statement. Component 2 is how we operationalize the position statement. And component 3 deals with how we monitor technological developments and recalibrate the technology position statement and the approach to operationalize it as appropriate, depending on whether the board considers it necessary. And this is the timeline that you will have seen at the last meeting. It's unchanged. Essentially, there's a targeted approval of the technology position in September. And you'll note that there's a full draft of the technology position in the current agenda paper, which will certainly change by the time we get to September. But that's the plan, at least. Okay, before I get into the questions, I hope you'll indulge me for just a couple of minutes. Fadi and I reached out to a bunch of board members and their TAs last week. I apologize, I couldn't reach out to everybody. That would have been ideal, but we didn't have time to do that. But we reached out to a bunch of board members and their TAs just to get a sense on what they were thinking about the direction this thing is taking and to help us set up the discussion for today. And it was actually a very, very helpful and useful discussion. And I'm going to talk about some of the themes that emerged, kind of like address them up front and maybe even win us some time. So about the position statement specifically, again, the aim of the position statement is to act as a technology compass for the board, but also, as Tom mentioned in his opening remarks, and the critically important part of it is also meant to act as a signal to the market that the IAASB intends to reorient itself away from what some observers have characterized as a position of technology agnosticism, rightfully or wrongfully. That's how some observers have characterized our current posture, which is agnosticism is referring to neither encouraging nor discouraging the use of technology in the standards. Certainly, as Tom mentioned, there are references to ATT and automated tools and techniques in the standards, but it's neither encouraged nor discouraged, to something that's more deliberate about facilitating and, where appropriate, even encouraging the use of technology by practitioners in their engagements, broader than audits, and by firms in their systems of quality management. Now, that position statement opens up with, you'll recall that first opening sentence is the fundamental tenet that deals with, that fundamental tenet deals with, I was advised when I joined this project by Tom, actually. He said, make sure that we anchor this technology position on this fundamental premise that technology, when properly deployed and supported by appropriate guardrails, has the potential to elevate audit quality. And another thing he mentioned is that, importantly, although it's not about encouraging the use of technology for its own sake, because it's the flavor of the day, but it's solely in the service of enhancing audit quality and accordingly trust in the reliability of financial reporting in the public interest. So that was my directive in terms of this fundamental kind of direction that that he thinks, at least, and we'll get the sense of what other board members think, the direction the board should be taking. So that's what that fundamental opening statement is all about. And we got some questions about that. I thought I'd address it. Another question that we got was, why in that opening sentence do we say that it's ultimately about the more consistent performance of quality engagements? Like, you'll appreciate that there could be other objectives that could be framed differently, but why did we frame it that way? That was very deliberate. That consistent performance of quality engagements comes out of ISQN 1, you'll recognize that that is the fundamental objective of a firm as they set up their system of quality management, is ultimately to drive the consistent performance of quality engagements. And we thought that that would be a good objective to kind of lay in here as in that opening statement of why this technology, this transformational impact of technology is so important, because it can drive that. Another important question that we got is, why does the position statement, why is it tilted so much in terms of technology used by practitioners and less so in terms of technology used by entities? Shouldn't it be a 50-50 proposition? We don't think it's a 50-50 proposition for the following reason. Although it's absolutely right, technology used by entities is important. Ultimately, engagement quality is about the actions of practitioners. Certainly, technology used by entities is important insofar as auditors need to be able to identify the related risks that arise from IT used by entities and respond to them. So that's why we included that theme, which is critically important, but it's not a 50-50, I don't think, at least, but we'll certainly hear from the board soon. That's why we included it as one of the 7 principles that supports this fundamental tenet. That was the reason for that. Okay, I'm just about to end my opening remarks, and we'll open it up soon for discussion. There were a lot of different perspectives that we heard during this really big outreach that we carried out during the last quarter in terms of what this technology position could look like. Some thought it could be, the position statement should be as short as 1 sentence. And their thinking there was, it's sort of like a mission statement. It's a 1 sentence. That's what it should be. Others thought it should be much, much longer than that. I'm in the camp that it should be a little bit longer. I think we landed on a page, but again, we'll hear the board's perspective on that. Some thought it should be more heavily weighted in other areas, as you heard, and some thought it should be in others. I think where it ultimately landed, I want to just impress and convey to the board that it was, at least, I think it grew organically out of all of the feedback that we got from the technology consultation group that we met, and they provided really valuable perspectives, and from all the other stakeholders and from the board members that we heard in March. I was given some really valuable advice from Wendy. Sorry, Wendy, that I'm name dropping you, but Wendy mentioned to me, what does success look like for this board session? And we were brainstorming that a little bit. And she said, let's not expect that all board members are universally going to fall in love with this position statement. And I think that's right. You put 10 really smart people in a room, they're going to come up with 10 different products, that's for sure. Or in the case here, 18. You're going to come up with 18 different products. I think that the goal here, I think what Wendy articulated, the success looks like is that the board agrees that this is a step forward in terms of the board signaling to the market, internal and also internally, that it's committed to a more deliberate and introspective kind of process in terms of thinking about the impacts of technology in its standard setting activities. And that's the success factor. And Wendy will tell me if I've articulated any of that incorrectly. All right, with that, I want to start with, I want to open it up to the questions. So we've combined the first two sections because I think they're kind of intertwined in many ways. If you're okay with it, I'm not going to reread these questions. Essentially, that first question is about, is that feedback that we described in the paper, does it capture all the feedback that you've heard? Is it complete? And more importantly, is the analysis of the feedback and the implications of the feedback, do you agree with that, how it's been described in the paper? And then section 2 question is about, what do you think of the position statement and how would you change it? And with that, I'll open it up.
Okay. Thank you, Angela. You're never name dropping when you mention Wendy's name. You're just heightening the credibility of the insight. And she would not leave in the middle of Bobby Jean either. Is that on that comment, Josie?
Sorry, it's miles away. I'm still thinking about how much I enjoyed that Bruce concert.
Okay. What we're gonna do is we're gonna start with Sachika, go down this side of the table, come around. Sachika?
Good morning, everybody. With regard to question one, I think there are no important themes that are missing, and I only have one question rather than a comment. And my question is relating to in theme two, basis for referring to technology in the IAASB standards. And in paragraph 22, the proposal states no change is proposed to the board position approach. But I am not sure if I understand what the proposal means. Particularly, I could not clearly understand the no change from what. And does this proposal mean that we will keep the current approach of referring to the technology in the standards and not taking such as PCOB's approach of mentioned in paragraph 21 in the issue paper? If that is the case, I am okay, but I just would like to confirm whether that my understanding is correct. And my comment to question two with regard to the proposed statement is that I really support the direction of the proposed statement, and I only have comments on the first paragraph that talks about commitment to the public interest, which I think is very important. And firstly, I strongly agree with the notion of achieving more consistent performance of quality engagement, which I think is very, very important. And I believe this very important thing could be emphasized more in the statement. And secondly, although the statement starts by talking about commitment to the public interest, the verb used in the following sentence is just recognize. And I think recognition is not enough for commitment. And I think we should have more active form of statement with a commitment to take actions. So I would like to suggest explicitly state in the statement that the IAASB will conduct standard setting and other activities by following key principles. And I have some wording suggestions, so I will send you offline later. That's my comment. Thank you.
That's great. Maybe for sake of simplicity here and guiding the discussion, we should do section one first, the questions on that, and then revert to the statement, just so we get some clarity on it. But Sachika, your points are well taken, and I wasn't clear about that up front. So more as it relates to the technology position statement, we'll put this on the record that as I think your key points are making it more clear that we're for the consistent performance of engagement, of high quality engagement. And secondly, that it's more active in terms of its statement on what our commitment is. Okay, we'll hold those here and take comments on section one. Sammy?
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Angela. Good morning, everyone. And for the paper, I would say thank you, Angela, for the paper. It looks very neat and clean and organized and easy to follow. With regard to the themes, and if there is something that could have been covered more within the paper, I would say I would like to get like a closer snapshot of the current status as is with regard to how much development there is and the AI tools being used. Is it just tools that are being used for vouching and tracing, or is it something that's much more advanced than that, like a tool that can read 100 pages contract, identify the most important articles, and tell you if the transaction is a sale or a finance or option, whatever that is, and you don't have to make judgments and just go home, which can help in making our statement later on. Is it just encouragement, or is it that we arrived at a stage that encouragement is not enough anymore? So this is one area with regard to the themes. Another area, I guess, it's very common in the public interest at the moment, is the attractiveness of the profession. I don't know how the use of AI can affect that? Would it attract more individuals, young professionals to join? Or is it going to be something like, okay, the machine going to do the work, we don't need any more accountants? And this can affect also how we react to that. With regard to part B of the question and the view on the analysis of the feedback, I think at one location or at one place we said we should work on eliminating the barriers to the use of AI. I'm not sure if there are barriers right now. It's allowed for, I guess, everyone to use the AI. I would call it more like updating of the standards to accommodate the development taking place in the AI world. Thank you.
Thank you. Kai?
Very supportive of the direction we're heading here, and I think it's really important that we do update our technology position. And as Sami said, he wasn't sure that there are barriers. At least there are perceived barriers, and we need to more actively drive innovation in this area. So very, very supportive, and also my comments in line. Don't have to repeat what Sachiko said, but could we even be more active on driving the future?
Sure.
This is good because I'm going to build on what Sachiko said. I agree with what she was saying, and also with Kai, that I think, you know, our commitment to identify and remove barriers that deter practitioners from deploying technology is really important. I had maybe just a couple of suggestions. One was around the piece towards the end, which is talking about the feedback that we get and keeping the board up to date. And I just wondered about whether we have a role, or at least an opportunity slightly wider than that, in sharing some of that feedback more widely, you know, amongst our stakeholders and things. One particular group I thought was really important is some of the commercial software providers, because they sort of drive how people implement our standards in practice. So keeping those up to date, I think, is probably more beneficial. And also just the fact that if we are doing this stuff, it is of interest to a much broader group. A couple of other specifics on some of the risks. There's a lot of reference to AI, and clearly that's you know, that's a sort of current concern. But I think if we go back to some of the work that Danielle did, she had a great big map of all the technologies that are going on. It would be good to sort of reference some of that. One other specific point, I think, is when we're talking about the use of technology essentially being required, or that there are jobs where technology is essential. I think last time we talked about it in the context of a kind of parallel with what we've got in 330, which is where substantive procedures alone are not sufficient. And I think that kind of framing in the context of almost like, you know, not using technology is not going to be sufficient, allows for flexibility for deploying other methods of getting there, and also perhaps reflects into the scalability piece. I've also got some drafting things which we can send offline, but the key thing, I think, is just getting the move towards removing barriers to the use of technology, and hopefully that helps.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks for the presentation. Really good to get that input. Some of my comments might reflect back in the position statement when we get to it, and I'll try not to replicate. Some of the feedback, particularly around the barriers, it says, you know, you engage with the auditors, they said their barriers, the board agreed that barriers, and then we got to the point to say, we'll explore if there are artificial barriers. I feel like we didn't take that full feedback on. It says there are barriers. A piece of work will be to explore if there are barriers, but our articulation is that they're artificial. So it's almost as if we concluded that there aren't, and we're going to pursue that. Overall, I feel like we're quite risk averse here. We're highlighting more risks than opportunity, and that then translates into putting guardrails in place. Now, I agree with the principle, but the feedback around using words like guardrails feels like we're not going to embrace and encourage. We're going to hinder and we're going to box it in. Guardrails to me would be, we're putting barriers in it to say, stay in this lane, keep in this box. Maybe the word doesn't necessarily correlate to what we're trying to achieve, but my overall sense is that we're focused on risk, we're focused on trying to control, and that would then limit perhaps what we're able to achieve when we start getting into the positioning paper.
On that point, Neil, one of the things that I questioned when I read it, and maybe it goes to the point, is that we're using terminology that we think we know, like the term artificial before barriers and guardrails. It has a meaning to us, but may have a meaning for other people, and there may be more elegant terms. To me, like I felt like what guardrails were meant to connote is that we support the use of technology in a reasonable environment, right? That can be enforced, can be overseen, can guarantee us quality, but it's not meant to like put shackles on technology either. It's supposed to be like, let's give people confidence that there's this terrain that technology can operate in and you can have confidence in, and we're sort of almost blessed in it if it's within these boundaries. So I think it's this question of that, and like the term artificial barriers, I don't know what artificial means something to us. I know we all know what it means. It means that there's constraints put on for perceived or real reasons, and that if it wouldn't hurt audit quality, why are we placing those barriers on?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess if I go to the two words, when I think through guardrails, it feels like it's a stronger railing than let's try and operate in this environment. The guardrails are prohibitive to me. We're not sure what we're trying to guard here. When I speak to our tech teams, what they were telling me last week and what they're telling me this week has evolved significantly. If I'd placed guardrails and boundaries on them, they wouldn't have explored some of the opportunities. So the word, I agree with what you've shared. The word guardrail feels too strong. And then the word artificial barriers, it sounds like they aren't barriers, they're artificial. They're not there. But we haven't actually done that work to conclude that yet. Where we have definitions that, for example, the auditor is defined as a person, and therefore every requirement that says the auditor must, if you were to use technology, that would mean it hasn't been achieved because you didn't use an auditor who's defined as a person. Those could be barriers. Let's explore them, but I wouldn't conclude that they're artificial.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Eric?
Thanks, Tom, and Angelo and your team, Patty, as well. Really appreciate the work of trying to herd the cats and put all this together in a meaningful way. I think that's been a great start to the process. In terms of the themes and the analysis, I had the same reaction to the words of our artificial barriers and guardrails that Neil has eloquently articulated. I was a little bit confused about what we really mean by that, so I support his reaction to that. The one that I focused a lot on in the themes was theme number 2. Basically, given the experience as a member of the Audit Evidence Task Force and sort of how all of this has affected our task force as we've gone through the project. I think this was an important theme. It was a theme that when we do get to the position statement, I was struggling to see where it was appropriately reflected. But you'll remember that one of the things we really struggled with in the audit evidence task force was when we got the feedback on the exposure draft, and people were asking for a lot more material around technology and examples and what should be guidance and so on and so forth. I think we really struggled to articulate how that should be, how that should all be dealt with. And I think that was, to me, that was really part of the challenge of this sort of current approach that we have. And I didn't really see that reflected in the theme, the way it's been articulated here. So I think we could expand on that in theme number 2. And like, and as Sajiko said earlier, I wasn't sure what we meant by no changes proposed to the approach. What does that really tell us? Because when we do get to the position statement, I would like to think that if I was doing the audit evidence project again, I'd be able to take that position statement that I'd know how to write the standard. Thanks.
So, just to expand on what you were saying, to some extent, our conclusion in theme 2 may be too narrow, because you're saying it's only focused on what we will do in the standard itself, maybe the ability to incorporate technology themes in the standard. But what you're saying is really, that is a key, a really important change, but we should talk about a little bit more of the broader toolbox that we would also have to it, and provide more guidance in that standard about, okay, you're writing the standard for audit evidence. Now I'll know what I'm able to do in the standard, what I need to provide as guidance, what is application material, et cetera. Right? Is that the thrust of your comment there? Okay. Chriselle.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the paper, very insightful. And I support the direction that you have taken in the paper. I would suggest considering 3 additional proposals. The first one is related to the difference in pace of change between technology and standard setting. While standard setting takes several years between the identification of a project need and the standard effective date, new technologies can emerge in a few months. The board will need to consider new ways of reacting to technology innovation to catch the pace while maintaining due process in the public interest. So it's not only a question of scalability, but also a question of proactivity for me. The second proposal that could be considered is how the board can better incorporate expertise about technology when deliberating about new standards. The technical skills required for the proper standardization of auditing and assurance are specific, and the board will have to rely on scientists in one way or another, I think. And finally and thirdly, I also want to reflect on the board commitment to strengthen the guardrails in the standards that ensure appropriate technological resources are obtained, developed, implemented, maintained and used effectively. I would like to reinforce the importance of confidentiality and the client data protection by the auditor, and the critical need to understand the logic behind tools and algorithm use and related documentation. I think it's a very important point for the profession. Thank you.
Thank you, Christelle. Bill?
Just 2 comments from me. From the feedback, I'll talk about the position statement later, but from the feedback, just as a general high-level comment, I got the feel that the standards are not fundamentally flawed in any way. So that is a feeling of confidence we ought to start with. And the second point is the one that Christelle raised, is that technology is changing so rapidly, and we must have a mechanism in place to respond rapidly. And that's I'm not sure that I'd just like to know how we're going to do that, particularly with respect to standards. We can issue authoritative guidance quickly, but as I raised yesterday, I don't think we have a quick way of responding to a gap in a standard quickly.
Yeah, agreed. It's sort of like, what do we have in our toolbox for standard setting that we could perhaps use in that regard? Julie, thank you.
Thank you. And it's a bit of a reflection on, Neil, some of your comments. I think it would be worthwhile for us to have some feedback in the benefits of technology, to be a bit more balanced in our feedback, because if I think about how I did audits when I first started and I think about how they're done today, it's night and day. And I think a lot of that is technology driven, and I think there's been a lot of benefits. And so I think to actually get some direct feedback on the benefits would be helpful, because that might actually help our guide some of the things we might consider in our toolbox. Josephine, to your point, things that we could be doing that could promote technology to actually in the spirit of quality. So I want to reflect on that. And then I don't know if this is blurring a little bit into the position statement, but I was looking for something more like a framework we might consider setting out for technology, as opposed to a more granular commitment at this point to some of the standard setting activities. But I think we would be wise to have some sort of framework we set out as to how we would approach it.
Thank you, Julie. Ado.
Thank you, Josephine. So a number of thoughts. First of all, there's nothing to do with section 1, but with the proposed timeline for approval of the technology position, which says September 2024. So I clearly must have misunderstood something, but when we parked audit evidence, we did it because we weren't sure, and there was ambiguity of whether the audit evidence standard needed to address technology directly, or whether this should be done out of the standards. And there were so many questions around the strategy and work plan, as well as 500 in respect of technology, that we sort of parked it, and we were going to figure out how are we going to address technology in the standards or out of the standards. I think I've been quite clear that I don't think it has a role in the standards, so and per se, but and I'm reminded by Julie, who says, yes, when I started audits, it was all pen and paper. We use all sorts of technology now, including AI, data analysis, whatever, and it's all been possible within the current construct of the standards. Yes, guardrails, all fine, but those are in ISQM1. Do we need to consider the use of technology? Yes, it is a resource. It's in 220R. So I'm also sort of careful in, we don't need to boil the ocean. Well, the practice is able to deal with this. So that on the time, so when I look at the timeline, I'm still disappointed. I would have thought by September, we would have direction on whether we're going to deal with it in the standards or not, because that is a direct input for the risk and response and audit evidence project, for which we're waiting on the direction. I struggle to see how we can proceed without having that direction. But as I said, I must have missed something, clearly misunderstood, apparently, what we were discussing at the time. But I'm troubled by it. And I think in respect of technology, so a lot of the themes that are out here, yeah, they're fine. I have some comments here and there. I do get the artificial barriers. Well, how I agree with the point on barriers. So we've been able to progress and use technology within the current construct. I am all for encouragement and giving examples and helping other firms out in using technology, because I firmly believe that some of the audits we can't do without, but that goes back to the resource question from 220R again. And others can be more efficient. Great, do it. The guardrails, yeah, we don't know what we're going to deal with in 2 years' time. So if we are talking about ensuring that we have guardrails, that's a difficult task. And do we really need them other than some firm principles in ISQM1 for the development of technology? Because that's, I think, the level where it needs to sit. I had, yeah, so I'll leave it that, and yeah, as a result, I have some of these comments filtered through to the technology position. I can largely live with the technology position, but I'm anxious to understand what are we going to do next, because there's somewhere around the table, I get the impression that some board members think that it should be integrated in the standards itself. I don't think so. I've looked at the PCAOB's position. They don't think so either. And I think that's an important aspect that we need to consider for the global operability of our standards as well. Thank you.
Yeah, on that last point, you may have a difference with some of us on the board. The question, I always thought we are giving guidance on what we actually will do in the standard here. And that the point between now and September was actually to come up with the so what, but we needed a statement that gave us the compass to agree the so what. Angela, did you want to come in with some clarification? No, and then I'll go.
Yeah, just a couple of comments. Certainly not going to be able to pick up everything. Really great input from everybody, but you know, I wanted to come back to this thing that's been brought up by Sachiko now and by Ado. There are fundamentally two different standard setting approaches here. There's no doubt. The PCAOB does have they do not reference in their standards technology assisted analysis. They certainly are monitoring it, and to the extent that it's creating challenges, it gets reflected through a change to their standards, and that's what they just did. They came up with some amendments that they just ratified. It just got published a few days ago. So this board is fundamentally taking a different approach here. We do call out ATT. Under the assumption there is that ATT is we want to call out the potential benefits of it, but we also want to call out the potential risks. And we think that the risks deserve to be called out because they warrant special attention. And that's the approach this board has taken. So that's when I mentioned Sachiko, no change. I guess I could have been clearer. I mean, the board has taken that approach. I think it's the right approach. It's not the only approach, but it is an appropriate approach that this board's taken. On the guardrails piece, I listened to a speech by the Basel Committee chair, and he was talking about financial stability. He was talking to the world about what banks are doing. And he said, this AI is wonderful. It's got lots of opportunities and it can do a lot of things, but let's be careful, because within the context of a bank, of course, we're not talking about banks here, and we're not talking about systemically important financial institutions that can cause a global problem in financial stability if one of these AI tools goes wrong. But I think the point also does have some parallels to, do we leave the question entirely to the firms as they create their systems of quality management to decide what's in and what's out? Yeah, I think by and large, I think most people around this table are going to agree that the firms should have a lot of discretion. They're the ones that are at the leading edge of the technology wave, and they've got both the competence and the expertise that maybe we don't have to make those determinations. And that's a really cogent and reasonable perspective. But I think the standard setter also needs to be thinking about, do we leave it entirely to the firms? Or are there things that a standard setter also needs to weigh in on? I'm in the camp that I think there is a role for the IAASB. Now, I'm not sure if this is going to be a popular perspective, but I think it is a reasonable perspective for something that the board should think about. And what I'm talking about here is, Christelle mentioned, auditors should be able to understand the processes that a tool uses in coming up with its output. As you start to get into this generative AI kind of stuff, and you start looking at it, and I've been looking at it, it's dizzying how complicated it is. Tokenization is fundamental to generative AI, and we're talking here trillions of tokens. I hope I'm using the right number, but it gets incredibly complicated. Auditors are never going to be able to understand those processes. They might be able to triangulate the outputs and say, the outputs make sense because I'm able to tie it to, look, that happened, this happened, makes sense. But are they going to be able to understand the processing? Very unlikely. How can you, the training data that went into ChatGPT 4.0 is all of everything that humans have produced since the beginning of time in written form. Are you going to be able to understand that? So the fundamental question there, I think, is something around, does the standard setter have a role in augmenting ISQM1 around things around explainability and maybe unproven technologies? But that's something for the board to think about and deliberate. But I just wanted to come in on those two things. Thanks, Tom.
Vishal.
Thank you, and good morning to everybody. I would just like to share that whether we would also want to cover, so we are covering the use of technology, whether we would also like to cover reporting on technology, because I'm coming off with a background that in India, recently the government has mandated reporting in case of the companies. We have over 2 million companies in India, and all the auditors are required to report whether the companies using accounting softwares have maintained audit trail for all the transactions throughout the year. So all the auditors are supposed to report on the technology that is being used by the companies as part of their statutory audit reporting. So there are risks associated with that for the auditors and also the procedures that they need to comply with. So I believe that in this position paper, technology position paper, we should also cover something about the use of technology by the companies and reporting by the auditors on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Bill?
Sorry, follow on from a point that Edo said, and I think I heard it right, but before we go into question 2, I'd just like to consider whether we could consider approving the technology position statement before September 2024.
So at what point? We will not have a draft specifically today. I think by the end of this session, we will have a direction, in a pretty good direction. My hope is by September, it's just approving the actual language. Like, we will have to post something on our website for the world to see, but I didn't want this to be a drafting session, so that is the difference. But where we should be by the end of the day is to have a pretty firm idea of what should be in our technology statement. Then it will guide some of the specific, more detailed actions that would follow. Does that make sense?
It does, but I'd not like to spend a lot of time wordsmithing the technology position statement. But
Well, I was trying to avoid wordsmithing today. We could share drafts between now and September so that it's basically a ratification when it comes to September. So I actually have a few comments on it. First of all, I really want to emphasize something that Eric said, and it sort of goes to a few of the points that Ado said too, is there's a risk that we focus solely on standard setting itself or what's in the requirements and application material in the standards itself. We should sort of give a sense of, from an insight perspective, where we think the levers are as a standard setter. It could be standard setting. It could also be other supplements to the standard setting as well that will be necessary to implement the standards. I agree with Ado's general point is that the requirements, the principles themselves may be robust enough, but they may need further amplification in standard setting as it relates to conditional requirements alike on how you do apply technology in those instances. And really, I think that's at the core of some of the insights here, is that we may need to implement some type of requirements on a conditional basis, which we have been prone to do these days, to use conditional requirements as well. The other thing is that in the talk of guardrails, and I think actually guardrails is the way I wrote, Neil, where when I read it is that I've been using that colloquialism from time to time, but really we sort of mean quality management about the use of technology. And to me, this is another reason why I don't want to say that technology shouldn't appear in our standards. In fact, QM1 talks about technology, but we may need to amplify the QM standards in some way to deal with technology and the quality management of technological tools. If you look at the appendix that is provided here, it sort of explains how prudential regulators have built their own quality management system in relation to models or technology. And, you know, that should be on the table for us. I'm not saying we have to build ISQM3 today, but we may determine that that's the right place to go. If we're focused on, okay, let's give the regulatory community and users community confidence that the outputs of models constitute quality audit evidence. And so that's sort of where I was going on that. The final thing to say is that we should be careful not to make this just about AI. AI, in the expansion of AI and the potential of AI and the increased compute capacity going by AI and the power of it is clearly a driving force of why people think this is urgent. But it is not the only technological element that's driving our work. Like the rapid expansion of the API economy offers a lot of potential implications. Simple modeling, AI is just an expansion of modeling. That is a big element of what's going on. So I think we should be careful not to give the impression that this is only an AI initiative. AI is a driving force. It's clearly an impetus for what we're doing, but we have to address it. So our standards, going almost to Vishal's point, that it may be around the quality, it may be about conditional requirements. It may be we need to do something specifically about how entities are using technology down the road. And is there a specific thing we need to address? I'm not saying that we need to have a cryptocurrency standard or anything like that, but there are the deployment of technology that may require specific requirements in our standards. I don't know. It's a discussion worth having. Need to be sufficiently broad in the way we think of these technological themes as well, and not just give the impression it's AI. So those are my thoughts, Angela. Any reactions to that? Anything Angela said? This is a really good discussion. I think people are looking for us. They're still very focused. We're on the so what. What are we going to do? Can we get this statement done and move on? But can we do it in such a way that refers to broader themes, broader usage of technology? Angela, any reaction from you and Fadi?
And Tom, you brought this up a few times. I'm interested in what other board members also think about this. And you've cautioned, let's not only focus this on AI. And I think that's a reasonable perspective. I kind of view the tools that we've had up until AI as sort of like rules-based, easy to get your arms around. You know, you look at the algorithm, it's easy to understand. When you start talking about neural networks, we're into a substantially different area. It's something that's a little, the reason why I bring this up is ISQM1 already does have principles within it. I agree with you. This is ultimately about quality management. And there are some principles in ISQM1 that they're not as robust as perhaps and we'll talk a little bit about that later as we do a gap analysis and the board gets a chance to react. ISQM1 has one paragraph essentially that deals with the principles that a firm uses when they're developing, acquiring technology know that the tool is operating, know that the data that's going in is good and good quality data, know what your output is and all of that good stuff. And those are all good principles. There's some stuff around governance that could be probably added, but by and large, when you're talking about rules-based kind of stuff, it's generally pretty good. But when you start talking about this reliance on this neural network that's spitting out stuff that is really very difficult to understand, I feel like you're in a different space. And that's why I'm referencing AI as much as I am. But I think your general direction, I think we should keep that in mind. It's broader, and you mentioned the API proliferation, absolutely. But I just wanted to just weigh in on that. Thank you.
Wendy, and then Hernan.
Thank you, Tom. And as a member of the Technology Consultation Group, this input is really important. I get a few things here, and I think we've bantered around, you know, Angela, you posed the question, is it the IAASB's responsibility to do this? And I think it absolutely is. And the reason for that is all the comments that we've received in the last year, whether it was on audit evidence or the work plan, the stakeholder group needs us to put a stake in the sand and come up with a position. And again, back to what you quoted me on, everybody isn't going to love it. So I think all the points made here today are, so, you know, many of the same points that I heard from my outreach group. But the one thing that I didn't hear, and including what Vachel said about the focus on the client first, you know, because we're auditing clients, it's not about us first. But the one thing I didn't hear today that I would like some feedback from the board is on scalability. Are there any concerns about the direction that this is going from a scalability perspective, size of client, you know, size of audit risk, whether it's a PIE or the group in the middle or LCE? Do you have any concerns or any inputs or something you'd like to see in the position or in any of the themes that would address that?
I'll just jump in really quick. There is, and Tom, I'm sorry, I'm dropping your name quite. Tom did mention, let's telegraph very prominently in the position statement that this is not going to be about requiring technology to be used in all engagements. And we've done that, I think. Because to your point, there are going to be entities that you can audit with very traditional, very simple kind of technology or no technology. I mean, I've seen entities in my inspection days at CPAB where you can 12 transactions per year, mining company development stage. You don't need technology to audit that. You don't. So I think the board needs to weigh in on that. I don't think there's any appetite from what I'm hearing from the board that we're ever going to require that. But to Sue's point, and to Tom's point, there might be a conditional requirement where the auditor needs to think about whether they need to use technology. And I think that's fair. And, you know, I know Ado mentioned maybe we don't need a requirement like that, and that'll be a good discussion for the board to have. But on scalability, I don't think that there's a scalability problem here, because the point here is that it's not going to be a requirement as far as I'm hearing from the board.
Hernan?
Thank you. Well, thank you, Angelo, for the work done so far. I had the opportunity to discuss this topic with some colleagues in Latin America, and in general, they welcome and support the decision of the board to develop a technology position. But meantime, my impression was that there is a lack of understanding about what a technological position means. That's why I believe that in our future technology position statement, it should be highlighted that we are not intended to introduce specific requirements about using technology, because much people could feel that it is not reflected, at least in the text of we have in the paper. In my view, adding a text similar to the text in paragraph 45.8 could help to clearly explain what our technological position is, as well as it is not. Thank you.
Josephine?
Thank you, Angela. I just wanted to come in on that comment that you made on conditional requirement. I wasn't going to say anything because I felt it was already quite clear, but I would agree that with Tom's summary there, that there is a risk we're only focusing on standard setting, and those conditional requirements, I'm not comfortable with them unless they are truly taking the principle and expanding it to a specific situation to achieve the objective of the standard. And that we have to keep them principles-based because they're global standards. We have this whole discussion with sustainability assurance. And we can't just repeat them by just plopping in the word technology. It's almost like back to our whole conversation about professional skepticism. We really, really are very careful about not having requirements that say just be more professionally skeptical in this situation. And we don't want to fall into that trap with technology. So, I feel also the same way that we do need to think about all the tools in our toolbox that we have and what's the best way to actually deliver the messages we need to deliver and help people and support people when they are delivering on those requirements and they're using technology to do that, and also educating them, like the supplements, the appendices, etc. So and I think part of the reason why I want to come back to it, because I was a little bit unclear about that reference in the paper about everybody was happy with the conditional requirement when we talked about audit evidence. I wasn't, and there were others who weren't happy about it either. So I think we have to be very careful about how we're using it. And so I just wanted to support those comments on that. So thank you, Angela.
But Josephine, just as a clarification here, because this actually is a really important point for the board in terms of answering Eric's question, like what will I do going forward as writing a standard, is you don't object in principle to the idea of a conditional requirement, but it has to flow from a general principle in the standard and about a specific application of technology to it. It's not that much different, by the way, to how we wrote the conditional requirement on double materiality. It's like emanates from the broad principle and then it gets more specific, right? You don't want us to be repeating or creating new principles at odds with the general. And then if I go back to Edo's point, Edo's basically saying, let's be cautious about how we introduce things because the principles of the standard work. And so we only really want to add additional requirements when we perceive potential barriers maybe in the standard. I'm just trying, because this is going to be really the guidance to us to how we choose which tool we use. Warren and then Kai.
So I'm also a member of the technology group, just for the sake of transparency. But there's sort of three groups of people, I suppose, when it comes to this technology stuff, nice and technical. There are some that are incredibly excited and want to go and play with this new toy. And I tend to fall into that group. Let's go and take this neural network and zap in some data and, see what pops out. And let's not be too worried about whether it's a test of detail or an analytic or a control for now. Let's just see what happens as we play with it. But there's another group of people, and there are a lot of them, who are absolutely terrified by this. And I'm concerned that if we start getting too prescriptive, and we introduce too many requirements, and we start amending too many standards and introducing additions and augmented documents, etc., that's going to just amplify the anxiety about technology. And the way I read these response letters is people are actually looking for educative material. They want us to help them to understand technology and how you can use technology within the constructs of the existing auditing language with which they are familiar. And that's really important. because the ISA standards for the auditors are the sort of the reference that they will use to understand this peculiar technology and how to apply it. And if we start changing that base while introducing all of these technologies, you've got both of them moving at the same time. There's no reference point anymore for this group of people. And we will amplify the anxiety about technology rather than enabling people to use technology and at the same time recognize all the risks that come along with it. So I tend to sort of want to iterate Bill's point about the need for speed and sort of settling the position statement fairly quickly. And then to Ada and to Josephine's point about focusing more on these are your core principles. They're actually not fundamentally broken. We're not having a paradigm shift. This is how you can apply all of these really exciting technologies in a sort of educative and helpful way. And something I brought up in our meetings was that EER guide. We just think about the leverage we got off of that EER guide by taking 3,000, nice base standard, and showing people how you could use it in a slightly different context. Many people responded very positively to that, and it was incredibly helpful for the sustainability task force when we were writing up 5,000. I'm also reminded, I can't remember which academic said it, but when it comes to technology, first mover is often the loser. I think we need to be patient here, developing educative material, experimenting with different ideas, testing those ideas outside of a formal standard, moves us along in the right direction without committing to a fundamental change to an auditing standard, which in a few months' time may no longer be applicable, or we realize we actually misunderstood the technology and our standard is wrong, and we have to go back and fix it. So, we also need to be thinking very carefully about the risks arising from technology. So to summarize, I think that the overarching principle here should be educative and enabling.
Okay.
Yeah, I just want to come back to the scalability point as that was being brought up here. I think audits is a wide range and how that can be done and whether or not technology is needed or necessary or improving quality may be different in different types of audits. Also, the tools and things that are available may be different jurisdictions and different firms. But if we do stay at the principle-based level, as we are considering, as we are directing the board are directing to do, I'm not concerned. And I think that also is helpful for audits and LCEs. There could be tools and things available for them, and that we have, as Warren saying, we're staying at the principle level, having educational material and guidance that also allows us not having to relook at the requirements, because this evolution is going so quickly that the more definitive we are in our requirements, the more difficult it will be.
Yeah. So let me build off something that Warren said, the concept of enabling the use of technology in the service of audit quality, right? And so what you're basically saying that in many instances, the requirements are robust enough and that we would be better served by enabling it through guidance. But that does not, which I think that most of the board here is generally supportive of that concept. But it doesn't preclude, as we are drafting new standards, the consideration of technology elements in creating conditional requirements, provided it's built off a principle that could apply to all. Like, we don't envision at this point of our time one track for non-technology standards, non-technology enabled audits, and another track for technology enabled audits. We as a board think that the principle should apply to all, and in some instances could have some conditional requirements. One area I just really want to emphasize that I've heard a lot about, but we're forgetting here, is the QM element. That I actually believe, based upon what I'm hearing, is that an expansion of some of the principles in QM1 may be the most urgent need in terms of standard setting. And would be really helpful because it would give both confidence to practitioners about how it could be enabled and regulators about, okay, this is like the boundaries of which, going almost to Neil's first point, what the space could be. And I just want to make sure when we're talking about all the conditional requirements, QM1 is not a conditional requirement or an expansion to maybe a QM3 or whatever it is, but that's a space of real standard setting of which the appendix alludes to, because that's what prudential regulators have done in this space. So on that point, both our QM1 guru, Julie, raised her card, and Ada raised his card. Julie, you want to go first, and then Ada?
I was just going to come in and really support what you just said, Tom, because despite the fact that technological resources in QM1 might be a one paragraph, it's not been a one paragraph effort for firms and by any stretch of the imagination. And I think that it's been really helpful in setting a framework for how firms need to think about technology. Like, it's probably been an area where we focused more than others because of some of the requirements and some of the new thinking around it. So I would be highly supportive of something like thinking about building on some of the concepts in QM1.
Yes, and I can only echo that, Julie. Well, that's exactly the direction I'm thinking of as well. Is it needs to sit in QM1 in 220, 200 maybe for the general direction, or some of the conditionalities are probably also better in 200 to 20 rather than in a 500, for example. So that's entirely aligned with my thinking. I'm very glad you raised that. Thank you very much.
That I think that's really important. So we're talking less in the ICEs themselves to think about robust requirements and all over the place, but QM is a potential fertile area. Sachka.
Thank you. Hearing the discussion about conditional requirements, and I'm not thinking about creating a bunch of conditional requirements, but I just do not want to close the possibility of whether there is really necessary to have some type of requirement that attach to the technology so that the people can perform high quality audit, and so that the people, there is no barrier to use technology. So I think maybe QM is one of them. And so that's why I really appreciate what Tom said. And also that is why I think attaching to the fundamental of a high quality audit is needed, because I think that also alleviates the concern of scalability, because I know that technology is not needed for all audits, but if it's needed to achieve consistent and quality audit, it is needed. So I think that is why I think achieving high quality consistency issue is very, very important as a fundamental concept. Thank you.
Yeah, that goes back to what you said, that will feed into the statement itself, making that clearer up front. But I think we're getting to a point that standard setting could include conditional requirements under certain circumstances, could include, for the purpose of ensuring quality and enablement, action in the quality management standards and related standards, and can include guidance maybe along the lines of what we did in the ER, to apply the standards in ways that are technologically enabled. We'll go to Neil, and then I'll turn it back to Angelo to try to sum up this session and his takeaways.
Tom, it comes back to, I think, the support for a QM type approach. I really support that. And then it comes back to scalability. So not all technology is the same. And what we need to make sure is that we've identified I kind of see it in two tracks. We've got fast lane and slow lane. And the fast lane things are things you can deploy quite quickly. They're really cool, lots of fun. They drive quality, they get you efficiency, but they're actually not a huge driver of audit evidence as such. And then you've got slow lane technology. This is a big piece. It's a complex model. Then the big driver of actual evidence. It needs a lot more testing, a lot more understanding. So we just need to make sure that we think through these quality management things, but bear in mind that not all of it is equal, and some of it may be able to be accelerated through to get it deployed without it, going through as many checks and balances as something which is really comprehensive and drives audit evidence.
Yeah, sorry, Angela, I did see Billy's card. Well, Billy and then Angela.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you to all the board members for all the great input that we've received today. I think, one of the key things that I've picked up through the discussion, I think this is all going to be about getting the balance right. Because, for example, Warren, you talked and you alluded to the fact that, it's a lot of education. That's what people are looking for. But also what we heard, and Kalina will attest to that on the feedback on the ED 500 project, is people also did say that we want something authoritative. So again, there's that balance that we will have to maintain. So I think, so people are also through and at least this is how we've interpreted this, is through having something authoritative, they also see that as permission to do this. It's that comfort, it fits in with what's in the standard. We're not stepping outside the bounds. And again, with what Neil's comment was, that's all good and fine, but don't box people in. So that's again all about balance. So I do agree, all of this will have to be at the principles level. And hopefully, Josephine, you also saw that we deliberately put in those words of while preserving the foundational value, the foundational value of core auditing and assurance principles and concepts, because I think that will always be the starting point. I do think, and Tom, you alluded to it a little bit in your summary. Yes, there's probably something to be done around the QM 1, 220, 200 level, but we cannot exclude the fact that there may be stuff in the other standards as well, because there's a tipping point. At the moment, we've been very used to saying, no, it's all implicit in the standard. But I think we're reaching a point where there's a tipping point where, yes, but maybe there is something to be said because of new risks that have come to the fore, etc. So for me, that's the key message, is this: within everything we heard today, we'll need to try and navigate this going forward. Thank you, Tom.
Wonderful conversation. Josephine hit me up she's like, I underestimated. We're probably going to need more time, which is good. This is what we wanted. I wanted to just pick up on a couple things in the next. I want to go to, and Tom, I think we're going to go to section 2 pretty soon and just talk a little bit about that technology position statement.
After the break, we are going to go
after
to
the
section
break. Really quickly, I think I've heard a little bit about, well, the position statement isn't answering this question, it's not answering that. I don't think it's intended to, and and this is something for the board to consider. We never intended that position statement to be answering the questions. It's to provide a direction. So things around, we're going to explore the need for requirements, whether they sit in QM, in the performance standard, that's to be determined later. And, to Ado's point, let's get moving on that, because there's project teams that need that information. That's certainly the priority. And in fact, we're going to have something for September. But the position statement itself is not going to be answering those questions. The board is going to get an opportunity to deliberate on all of that as we start to develop this gap analysis and so on. One other thing, I'm noticing we use this word conditional requirement quite a bit. And to some of our observers, that might be a little confusing, because it's not a conditional requirement means if this, then that. If you're asking an auditor to consider whether you need to use technology, that's not a conditional requirement. That's a the world, the state of affairs is such that maybe you need to use technology to accomplish your, to Josephine's point, engagement objectives. We're not going to create these objectives. These are engagement objectives that are specified in the standard. And there might be circumstances where you might need tech. I come from a banking background, as I've mentioned to you, to this board in the past. And I was leading the inspection unit at the audit regulator in terms of inspecting these banks, these bank audits. And I will tell you that I was in some of the more regional banks, and I was seeing very manual audit procedures. I was getting very, very uncomfortable. How could you possibly audit an institution like that, an expected credit loss model, without the use of technology? You need to be using technology. And that's kind of like what the thinking here is. It's not a conditional requirement. Perhaps it could be some, but that's a conversation for later. The position statement is not intended to answer that. It's a commitment by the board to explore these things. And I think that's what we're doing. But anyways, on that.
So actually, I understood the guidance that we were getting here is that purely saying in our, we'll talk about the specificity of the technology statement, is that explore may not be enough guidance to us. Like, I thought some of the discussion here was leading us towards this is, we will utilize maybe in a more active sense, conditional requirements or some other forms of standard setting in these ways, guidance in some circumstances, and hoping that our position statement maybe even a slightly more directive than explore, because it keeps open. But that's a discussion that we'll take up after the break. Explore is a very open-ended term, and it really leaves a lot for the imagination. And maybe we won't be there yet, but from what I heard today after section 1 is that people are committed to keeping things at a principle-based level that could apply to all audits, they're committed to using conditional or other requirements when necessary. I do think we haven't really debated whether our standard should say you shall consider the need for technology, and that's another step from a conditional standard. We have agreed that we need to potentially go and use QM as an example, not to guardrail things, but to enable through a sense of confidence in the quality of technological tools. And we've also agreed that there are other activities that we should use as a board, which includes guidance. And so this may be a prompt for us to be more directive about our commitments, going to Sachiko's opening points later. But on that note, I think it's a really good time to take a break. Let's reconvene. It's 10:40 right now at 11 o'clock, 20-minute break. And then we'll seek in the spirit of Bill to have a pretty firm conclusion that just needs to be drafted afterwards, which could be effectively ratified in September. Okay, can we get seated? Okay. Now that everyone's refreshed, potentially recaffeinated, we're gonna turn to section 2. Sachiko, your initial comments are noted and in fact seem to get broad support already directionally. But let's start with section 2. We understand that some of the summary that I gave that reflected the mood of the board will have to now flow into the final language. So I'll ask someone to lead off on section 2. Bill?
I'm very happy with the position statement. The only offering I'd make is some commentary is helpful on the human element. I mean, we do touch on automation bias, but we don't really embrace the fact that no matter what technology you're going to use, there's going to need to be a human element to interpret results and make sure there aren't problems. So however that can be worded would be helpful.
Anyone else? Neil?
Yeah, it certainly support the human element. So it's just, there's a human component always driving this. Otherwise, the view around artificial, automated tools and technology, there's definitely that human piece. I've sort of said my piece around removing artificial barriers. What I'd add to that is just to seek out redundancies in the standards as well. So it's not just about a barrier to using. Are there requirements there that are no longer necessary? So are there any redundancies? That would be a piece I'd add to that.
Okay. Any other thoughts? I think we'll strengthen the commitments in it along the lines we discussed earlier. More action, so it seems a little bit more action oriented. Any other comments, Angela?
Neil, you brought up with some of those redundancies. I thought that was a fascinating discussion. Do you want to just tell the board a little bit about what you're talking? Like, there's this implicit assumption that humans need to be involved. Like when we refer to an expert, and you're saying, well, that maybe your expert can be a tool, a silicone-based entity versus a carbon-based entity.
Yes, sometimes like the fraud standard, for example, says if you've got a forensic risk, consider allocating an individual with forensic experience. Well, you might actually just run a tool or technology to evaluate the cyber risk. It isn't necessarily a forensic expert. So sometimes the standards refer to individuals and people, and there may be an opportunity to refer to something other than an individual. An example of a redundancy that I had last week, my medical insurance getting updated, they want to come do some tests. The first thing they look to do is confirm my identity. They've got this terrific technology that looks at my face and analyzes it against the national database, and they confirm. But then they also wanted a photocopy. And when I said, why do you need the photocopy? They said, well, the auditors needed it. And I assume this is an internal audit and it's not a financial audit, but nonetheless, look for redundancies in the standard that perhaps we no longer.
KPMG client.
Yeah, sorry, but Neil, to your point, yes, there is a tool that will do that analysis, but you may still need that specialist to interpret and understand those results. And so I think And that goes back to the human element. So when it comes to redundancies, that doesn't mean that particular requirement, whatever it might be, is unnecessary. It just means that it's augmented in some way. Yeah, okay.
It may need to be augmented. Maybe the results come back. They don't need a specialist skill, but so it's augmenting, but it's looking for these things. You know, seek them out. Do the analysis to make sure we haven't just said no barriers or they're artificial. Seek them out. Go with the mindset that they could very well be there, and then that will help Eric's point around how to draft in the future. Draft with a more open mind that actually there's more than just a response with an individual that needs to be considered.
Kidding aside, this is along the lines of not bringing something from a digital world back into an analog world just to satisfy some requirements, right? It's a little bit of avoiding retrofitting here.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Okay, now I understand the point fully. Bill?
I don't know if this can be quantified in any way, but just to clarify my thinking, Angelo, not specific wordsmithing, but I'm getting the sense that on a spectrum, there's less need for revisions to standards and more need, as Warren said, to enabling and educating. Is that the right flavour that's coming through?
I'm not sure. I think, to me, one of the big markers that we're putting down here is that, first of all, we're willing to do stuff in the standards, that is a change in position. And I think that's a signal we're saying. We're also willing, resources permitted, to take a more active role in providing guidance. And that's a big thing. We will need to, that will have a resource dimension and a resource allocation dimension to it. We have the resources that we have. Writing guidance is substantial. Remember, on the EER side, many of you weren't here, we actually had seconded staff dedicated to write an EER, and we treated it as a full project at the board, and it went through due process. We may have to do that, and that's something we would consider as part of our action points. But I think that is on the realm. But I don't want to say that we absolutely tip the scale towards that end yet, though people seem to think that guidance is a really important element of whatever we do.
Okay, well then, the next thing is that let's try and use the national standard set as better as we can. There's a lot of guidance out there that can be grabbed and somehow socialized.
The one thing we do have to consider is the value. One of the things that made the EER particularly useful is that it did go through that robust process too. And people may be expecting something even sooner. It took some time to develop because we did have a due process on it in 2 parts, in fact. Okay. The one thing that I thought about, just thinking over the last couple of days, that we will need to possibly add and signal is that in whatever technology statement, we will have to consider ethical dimensions and coordinate with the ethics board in it. And if there are crossovers and they have dealt with technology as well, and we should probably be pretty explicit in whatever statement we have about our commitment to coordination with and complementing the ethics standards on this regard. That may be an element. Does anyone object to that? No. Okay, Angelo, back to you.
So before we leave this question, we move on to the next one. Really good input. I realize that a lot of you have really good ways to kind of fix some stuff and refinement. So please pass that along offline. We'll definitely consider all of it. One other comment that I got in terms of an addition, and maybe this might be something that the board might want to weigh in on, is we talk a lot about what practitioners and firms should be doing. Should we also telegraph within this document what the IAASB is going to be doing in terms of advancing? I think Brian brought it up in terms of what's our commitment to emancipating our own systems and our own processes in terms of, and maybe that's if we're gonna talk the talk, maybe we should walk the walk kind of principle. So we can talk about that. If there isn't any objection to that, maybe we'll bring it and show you a version of that in September. But overall, I think please pass along your comments and we can refine it. But I'm getting the sense that I think generally people are, the steer is that it's moving in the right direction.
One of the things I think I've taken from Bill and other comments, and the fact that there's other work streams going on, get in sight of a position statement sooner rather than wait to September is better. So maybe there could be some circulation of drafts or availability over SharePoint that people could provide active commentary. So by the time we get to September, of course, this will all be in the public domain when it gets to September. And we'll have a discussion about it, that we have a draft that is basically being ratified without much discussion. And we focus on the next elements of this about what's the so what, now that we have the statement there. Bill's giving me the double thumbs up, so I think I'm really excited about that. Does that make sense, Angela? I don't think there's that much to do to turn something around. Probably the technology group will want to get together once before we share it, but Angela?
Thank you, Tom. Okay, I have advanced the slide. So we'll pick up now the more organizational aspects of the technology position, which are the approach to operationalize, and then we'll talk a little bit about how we just preserve the suitability of it by just keeping an eye out on the developments. And anyways, on section 3, maybe this is a good conversation for the board to weigh in on. Do you agree with we are decoupling now the outputs of the approach with the approach itself? So what we have in the paper here, we've recommended that the approach be that we are going to develop a gap analysis, a heat map, a roadmap, all of those things that the board is going to get a chance to weigh in on periodically, and that are going to live organically on our website, such that also our stakeholders are going to be able to interact with. And there is where there will be things around analyses that would impact current project teams, and that's where the board will get a chance to deliberate on this stuff. But why don't we start at section 3, that question 3 on section 3, and then we'll move to that other section after we have a chance to talk about that.
Okay, we're dealing with question 3. And then I see you, Ted, we'll come to you after Christel.
Thank you. I would appreciate if the roadmap development process would be more precise. What will be the interactions between the board in the roadmap preparation and adoption? And is the roadmap approved by the board? Is it indicative or is it a work plan? So any indication on that would be really useful. Thank you.
Thank you. Hernan?
Thank you. Regarding point 3, in my view, we could link the technology position statement by adding the commitment to introduce in all our future public consultations specific questions on technology matters related to the topic we are dealing to. This posture could help us to comply with our commitment on the ongoing revision of the technology position, as well as to align the standards to our technology position.
Bill?
I like the operationalizing the suggestion and to get into a heat map. We've already had some conversation about what are the hotter ones, like ISQM1 might be an early one. And I just put on the table, we're going out soon with a going concern and a fraud standard. Perhaps they should have a gap analysis pretty early as well, because it'd be embarrassing to go out and not have responded or not have considered that issue with those 2 standards.
Neil?
The one piece around I'll skip it. Was just around getting feedback. I think in this environment, when it's moving very fast, some of it's a little sensitive and a bit more confidential. I would really encourage you to go one-on-one. So go to specific, go to a firm, go to a regulator. But yesterday in a big room, ask for feedback. Yeah, technology is important. Get one-on-one. I think you'll get far greater granular insights. And I wouldn't just go once. When I speak to our technology guys, what they told me last week and this week, it evolves really fast. So you need to just keep that going and keep it in smaller groups.
Neil, on that point, I don't know, this is where board members could be really helpful to the team and making contacts within, I'm using network not in the firm sense, your personal networks, if there are people that we should be speaking to.
Yeah, without a doubt, sure.
Greg?
Thanks, Tom. I guess my overall thought on this is it too narrow? So we're talking about gaps in the standards, which if we're thinking of our toolbox that we were talking about earlier, guidance, education stuff, if this is operationalizing our position statement, don't we need to have that broader lens of which this is a part of it? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Eric?
And maybe I misunderstood the first part of our discussions this morning, but what I was hearing was a lot of focus on ISQM1 and 220 and 200. And this is talking about a comprehensive review of all of the standards. I wondered if it would be, a first step would be to look at those three standards first to see if those are the areas, what are the areas that might need to be considered in those before we dive into spending a lot of time on all the other standards, which sounds like a pretty massive project to me, and I wasn't sure whether we could use our resources more with a more focused approach.
It's a really important point, Eric. I actually think that we do need to prioritize here. Particularly, we have an integrated project that we've committed to, and that would have areas related to 500, 330, and 520 should be top of the list because we are sitting on some elements of 500 right now, and the project teams are developing a project plan, and it has to inform a project plan for an integrated project. Well, I assume that was that level of prioritization, that we're not going to boil the ocean here. I've turned to Billy. Is that consistent with your understanding?
Yes, I think so, Tom. And so to your point, Eric, I think we do need to do this in stages and prioritize. We've heard a lot about QM1, 220, 200, those type of things, but we've also been thinking about the integrated project, and that's probably where we need to start. Part of it is to figure out what will inform the gap analysis, how the gap analysis will look, how are we going to share it with the board. But I think we need to be realistic. We're not going to go through a gap analysis of 38 standards and then revise the 38 standards based on that gap analysis. I think out of that gap analysis, Greg, to your point, we may find that some of this stuff does not need to be addressed through standards. Some of the stuff may actually just need some additional guidance.
Bill?
Isn't that what the heat map is? When we do a gap analysis and we do a heat map, isn't the heat map the standards which are most urgent to do and those which are not, or am I missing something there?
No, that's right. So the heat map will be the prioritization of the gaps. But the point is, I'm not going to pause the risk response projects so that I first need to do a full 38 standard gap analysis to get to a heat map. I have a project that needs to keep moving. And I want to focus the gap analysis first on the area of 500 and 330. And yes, the larger gap analysis will still take place.
We're agreeing. We're already effectively putting this in the high heat category, the integrated project. Ada?
So maybe I have a little bit of a different perspective on this. And I thought the discussion we had before the break was very rich in the sense of we need to be more principle-based. And if we look at standards, we're going to look at the standards that drive the majority of the standards. So ISQM 1, 200, 220 as a priority. I think the other standards that you refer to really are part of that other project team, and clearly we need to interact with the technology working group to the extent there are these perceived barriers or whatever. But I think for the purpose of this, I would not prioritize those the 330 and 500, because I think those I personally think that can be addressed better in ISQM 1, 220 and 200.
That's a conclusion on, that may be where we end up, and we may get there pretty quickly, but that basically decides something before it's been addressed. And we may get there quickly. My whole point is there has to be some conclusion to inform the project proposal sooner rather than later. And we very well may agree with your point, but there has to be a structured way to get there, and it has to be done quickly. Otherwise, there's a risk that the project proceeds and then the board is in a different place based upon some gap analysis.
Yeah, and that's fair enough. So can I then distill from this discussion that, yeah, those two standards that are part of that project, those three standards, as well as IMQ 1, 220, or 200 are the first on the docket, and it needs to be done quickly by September?
I don't know what the time frame the team is speaking of. By prioritizing, we mean prioritize. Billy, maybe you could give some thought about the process to get in, how this will inform a project proposal. But the project proposal is not coming for approval in September, is it? No.
Just want to get to my answer. So, I can with a lot of certainty say that the gap analysis, including QM1, 220 and 200, will not be completed by September. What we are, Tom's question, the project proposal for the audit evidence and risk response project is slated for approval at the December meeting. But what we were thinking in terms of, and I think the question was asked by Ado and a few other board members earlier, is what's next? I think what's next is we obviously need to approve the technology position in September, based on Bill's suggestion earlier, and Tom's intervention is that we may have an opportunity to circulate it with the board even before the September meeting. And then we need to proceed with the gap analysis, the structure of that analysis, and prioritizing audit evidence and risk response so that can inform the project proposal. So I think it will be good if at the September meeting, if we can have, because we've always, and Angela, I don't know, you didn't talk about specifically, there's the position, and which Angelo clearly indicated, the position is not going to solve the problems. The position is the guiding principles that shapes our thinking in terms of how to address technology in the standards. Then out of that flows deliverables, and those deliverables are the gap analysis and everything that goes with that flows into the projects, because the technology work stream cannot address all these problems. I mean, if there's an issue with something around audit evidence and the impact of technology on that has to be solved at the project level. So that's why we wanted to prioritize the focus on audit evidence and risk response, so that can properly inform the project proposal. If we can have a good view of that at the September meeting, then that sets us up well for the approval of the project proposal in December. But we also recognize that this is work that will have to continue in terms of, and there I fully agree with Ado, then it makes sense. QM1, ISO 200, ISO 220 would be some of the foundational standards that you start with.
Josephine?
Yeah, thank you. So just go back to that. I'm comfortable with articulating the priorities and certainly thinking more around QM 220-200, but I just hate to be technical and boring here, but the reality is if we're going to tinker out in our performance standards, they sit on the foundation of the assurance framework. So in the reality is if we are going to do things in terms of evidence or any of the other performance standards in the ISAs, they do impact the other assurance standards. So I think that the way that Angela was articulating it in the paper was right. Yes, we may be focusing on what is it about audit evidence that we need to think about. I understand that, but that affects all our assurance standards. So we can't lose sight of that because before we know it, then they're immediately out of date. So just bear that in mind that those standards it's a reasonable assurance engagement and ISA audit, and that sits in our foundation. So let's just not lose sight of that. Thank you.
We will not lose sight of that. Okay, Angelo, any reaction?
No, no reaction except for great discussion. I think we are going to, there's going to be more discussions that are going to come about once you see these documents. Clearly, there's a lot of questions about what are those documents? How much depth are you going in? Is that enough depth? And these are all very legitimate questions that I would have the same question. I think what we're trying to do here, and the reason why we decoupled it, is we didn't want to get lost in the details at this point. We wanted to give the board the opportunity to ratify a direction, and then we can have all of that rich conversation later. But there are clearly priorities, and Ado brought them up, and we have to address those sooner rather than later. So those are the kind of the commitments that we're driving at right now. Sooner rather than later, as Willie mentioned, stages. You can't, this is an ocean and it's got to be boiled, but do we need to do that in one day? We'll boil it over a long period of time, and we'll take it in stages, and that's the point. If there's no reactions to any of that, hopefully I didn't say anything too particularly controversial. We'll move on to section 4.
Bill?
Whenever I hear boiling the ocean, I'm concerned.
I had the same reaction and I decided not to.
So I don't think we are trying to boil. Well, that was where I was trying to go earlier about extent of where we're at. And it's not a boiling the ocean exercise, I don't think, because the standards aren't fundamentally broken. That's what I'm trying to.
No, we're going to try to keep this as simple as possible.
Agreed. I take it back. Okay. Section 4. Section 4, you'll recall from the paper, is about monitoring and adaptation. Now that monitoring, it's what I mentioned to some of the people that I've met last week is about, we do have a process in place. We have various sources of input. Some of them are more ad hoc. Some of them are very deliberate and have a regular cadence to them. So the question so obviously we described that the technology consultation group has been instrumental in helping us move this along. We have a DAG group, the Digital Advisory Group. We're meeting with them in July. Really impressive roster there of innovators and founders of companies, and they're on the leading edge, and they can provide some really valuable input in terms of where the direction the board's taking. We'll bring back those insights in September. Now, the question is our current process enough in terms of the monitoring? I've heard from some board members to say that maybe we need a more regular cadence of interactions with the audit regulators because they're the ones that are seeing this play out real time, and questions along those lines are things that the board can weigh in on. And then on the adaptation side, I come back to something that Wendy said, and sorry, Wendy, I'm going to name you twice. You saw the connect the dots reference in the paper. We've had a process in the past and where we bring these wonderful disruptive technologies presentations to the board, and you leave feeling very satiated. I know a lot about this particular topic, but what does that mean in terms of your day-to-day and your future activities? Nobody's ever deliberately connected those dots. We're going to try to structure these sessions now where the board will be able to introspect and connect those dots. And and make a decision about, are we still going in the right direction or should we deviate? And that's fundamentally what that is, that every 6 months we'll line up something really interesting for everybody along the lines of things that we've been doing, but maybe be a little bit more deliberate about connecting the dots. So asking the board to really weigh in on those two things. Is our current monitoring process based on what you see at other regulators, for instance, at the PCAOB or others, is that enough? And then in terms of the adaptation process that's been recommended in the paper, where we meet every 6 months and we have a disruptive technologies session, and where the board introspects a little bit about the direction we're going in, is that a good process, and should we ratify that?
Okay. Any comments on section 4? People generally or not?
Thank you. Regarding the question 4A, I consider strengthening the relationship with the national standard setter as well as regional bodies of national standard setter would be very helpful to monitor emerging technologies, as paragraph 69 states. But regarding question 4B, in order to understand how it could impact in our technology position, from my perspective, it is important to consider those national standard setters with a similar standard setting process approach of the IAASB standard setting approach. Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else? Thank you. Robert?
Yeah, thank you. I think the approach you're describing here in section 4 is valid. A few comments. Number one, the DAG, Digital Advisory Group, which I came across for the first time, and in our preliminary talks last week, I think I mentioned, who are they? I acknowledge the TCG. This is an internal group, but the DAG is an external group. So the question is, how do we get an exposure to their thoughts and to their reflections, whether it's directly, do they talk to us here at the board, or is it indirectly, do they talk to you or to the TCG and you share their views with us? I would like to have more thoughts about this. From my personal perspective, I would be very much keen having the direct input, but at least if it's not possible, go indirectly, but twice a year, as I think you're proposing. You mentioned in your reflections just a few seconds ago, there's been some input by other board members whether we should discuss our technology position and approach with regulators. I really haven't thought about this, and coming from the preparer side, I did not have much anxiety with regulators. But when I read some of the stakeholders' input in your paper, and I cite, some auditors avoid using technology and enabled procedures altogether to mitigate the risk of having their audit approaches challenged by regulators. So there's a huge, or seems to be some anxiety using technology, facing regulators' questions or so. I think it should, we should seriously think about getting in touch or getting in conversations with regulators. Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else?
So I'll pick up a couple of these. NSS coordination, Hernan, you brought it up. Absolutely. There's a few NSS parties within the network that already have processes. And they're on my Rolodex. I'm going to be reaching out to them right after this to see if we can coordinate, because we're not going to be able to do this on our own. And why should we do this on our own, right? Why should we be recreating the wheel when there are processes and there are really intellectual resources that we can rely on out there? So that's going to be a big part of the strategy, I think a lot more than it has been in the past. So it's going to be very deliberate, and let's see if we can set something up in that regard. The DAG, I was tempted, Robert, to mention who these people are, and I didn't get a chance to coordinate with Tom and Willie to see whether that was appropriate or not, because they're not always the easiest people to get in touch with. They're really great resources that we have, but there's no reason why we can't bring the DAG group to speak to, or one or two of them representatives to speak to this group at one of our meetings. There's no reason, and I think there's no, Robert, there's no, we want to keep it private, or we want to keep it absolutely, to the extent that we can bring resources and experts in to speak to the board. I think that's ideal as part of this disruptive technologies kind of periodic update that we bring to the board. So definitely we'll think about that. And I'll turn it over to Tom and Willie. They can speak to some of the representatives on the DAG if there's an interest. We can talk a little bit about that as well. And then in terms of regulators, you're absolutely right. They need to be part of this conversation for various reasons. Number one, they bring a wealth of knowledge in terms of what they're seeing in their inspections, but also to the extent that they are reluctant or apprehensive about the use of technology, then maybe we should understand exactly what that apprehension is, such that we can better navigate it. So I think that's definitely, they've got it. Maybe we need to have a more regular cadence with. We do speak to IFER periodically. Willie can speak to that about a bunch of topics, including technology, but maybe we can get a regular cadence of meetings with IFER and other regulators specifically to have those discussions, the FRC and others as well. But I'll turn it over to Tom. Did we want to speak a little bit about the members of the DAG?
So the DAG is not a secret, the Digital Advisory Group. And this, for many of the board members that are here, this reflects the journey that we've been on from the very start. One of my goals when I became chair was to put technology firmly on the radar screen of this board. And we did it through a number of means. One was developing a research function, and that generated both engagement. We've held roundtables amongst ourselves with some invited guests, including regulators. We developed research documents that have informed the board and others, that we included some publications on specific technologies. And we created a group of innovators, both in the space of audit and in adjacent spaces in the world of finance, and prepare groups, like including a former CFO of a major international bank, someone who's been a chief risk officer and now a head of an innovation function, and others on this group, to an entrepreneur, to help sort of stretch our minds on it. Now, what happened was this group, and we'll share the list of names with everyone after the meeting, is that when we had the transition for Danielle going, our development of this approach of technology, Angela's transition in, the group sat quiet for a few months, and we're reinvigorating the group right now at this very moment to provide us guidance. There will be a few of us at the table. We certainly will share the outputs of it. Intentionally, it's kept a small discussion because we kept the group small, 5 or 6 people at any given moment to stimulate and stretch our mind. So that meeting's occurring in the end of July and should help inform some of our activities. And we certainly will bring back any conclusions to this board or any themes to this board, but it's one out of many mechanisms to stay connected of what's actually happening and try to get us to be more ambitious in this regard. Any questions on the DAG, I'm happy to take on that, but it was based upon a similar initiative I created when I created an innovation function in my last life, is that you need to get people who are just not directly in your normal sphere to raise your sights and give you a slightly different perspective. Mark.
Thanks, Tom. Perhaps now is the time just to make some general observations about the whole discussion this morning. You know, obviously this topic is very much driven by public interest in seeking to improve the quality and efficiency of audits. So very much in the PIOB's territory. And from listening to the discussion this morning, I've got a much better perspective, frankly, of where you are in this journey, and you know, of the role of the position statement, the fact that it's essentially setting out your principles for this review. And Tom, as you said, it may end up being a sort of so what answer. I suspect, though, from the discussion that we've had, it's very unlikely to be a so what, that there will be quite a lot of actions coming from it. I think from a PIOB perspective, the conversation at times felt a little bit passive to me. I'd like to see a more sort of positive attitude and towards the embracement of technology, and picking up on actually one of the comments that Neil made about being more open-minded and positively seeking out, for example, you know, barriers to the use of technology. So a more sort of positive approach. I'd like to get that sort of feeling. In terms of the actual I can't even say the word, but you know what I mean, operationalization of the position statement. Picking up on what Robert just said, you know, one of the PIOB's recommendations is that in scoping this, you actually do look at the inspection findings of regulators, you know, because obviously, you know, those can identify some of the main causes and factors which affect or prevent audit quality in this arena, and also the sort of safeguards against sort of over reliance on technology. And one final thought. And this might muddy the water a little bit more, I guess, but of course, IAASB has a technology-related initiative as well, and that hasn't been mentioned. And I just wondered, you know, to the extent to which you're thinking of coordinating your efforts with theirs.
Last point, was my explicit point at the end of that last session on the position statement, is that we need to explicitly add coordination to with IAASB on this, because they do have a separate stream. So I think we agreed that we should make it explicit in our stance, and that should be an active consideration in everything we do. So I just want to give you I think in relation, I don't want to talk about to argue, but I think we got to a point that whatever our statement should be, it should be more positive and more of an active commitment. And I think that draws upon what Sachiko said, so that point's well taken too. So I just didn't want to give you a sense that we sort of the struggle with this board has is that everything we say is we're sort of working through things publicly, but I think there's a clear steer from you, but from others, to be positive in our commitments to this. And I think we'll incorporate that concept into the last thing. I think Angelo has now gotten a clear steer that regulatory engagement and regulatory interaction is really important, mainly because when we're out in the marketplace, that's a perceived barrier. Not casting blame on anything but regulators want to make sure that the acts of practitioners conform to our standards, and this is maybe why we need more either requirements or guidance to help demonstrate that that's the case. So all these points are really well taken, but I did want to say on the last point, we did commit to add in something in our technology statement about IAASB.
And maybe, Tom, if I can just add to that, Mark, in terms of our ongoing work, Angelo is a member on ethics technology group, and we also have an ethics staff member that attends all our technology consultation group meetings.
Okay. Right. It's a really important point. I'm glad we got this on the record. Okay, Angelo, anything more?
No, just a quick reminder, any drafting that you have at your fingertips that you think it would be helpful, please pass it along, and absolutely that would be helpful to me. And thank you very much for all of the great comments. I thought this was a really great session.
Okay, Mark, I think you gave observations, but if you want to come in and any observation in terms of the session.
No, that was all from me. Thank you.
Okay, so I think we're going to break into executive session now. We will return, I think. Can we shut the broadcast down, please?